Hello everyone, welcome to my patch 14.9 mid lane tier list. Now there has been a lot of different changes this patch, but not a lot of changes that have actually been impactful. So kind of talk you through it, but overall I haven't moved things around a whole lot, and you'll still find that the S and A tiers in particular are still pretty much the same as they were before. But the first change this patch were the fight item changes. So they did some changes to, as you can see, the fire items on screen, basically making Hex Trinket and more of offensive options. Desktop's got a fairly nice buff, Sterak's a nerf, Sundered Sky a nerf, and Eclipse a nerf. So overall, mid laners don't build these items a whole lot. The champions that these do affect, there's a few. So, for example, Jace into Assassin matchups, Eclipse being a little worse, and Maw being a little worse in the early game, right? Like if you're rushing out a Hex Drinker versus an Akali or something, that's obviously worse. But you normally do just go Eclipse instead. And obviously you don't really build the other items. So I think there are a couple matchups for Jace where that is hurt. That being said, the Eclipse nerf isn't the biggest deal in the world, right? And it's only in your melee form, down by 2%. So, yeah, honestly, I think Jace is still fine. Some other champs that are affected by the Eclipse change are Nefiri. I've got Nefiri pretty low on the list. I think Nefiri was already kind of struggling. She's like more of a scaling AD assassin, but she kind of gets outscaled by a lot of things. And Zed is another one where I feel like the best Zed build is by far the one with Eclipse. So I've put them both down a little bit. But I honestly don't think it's definitely not game breaking, right? It's only a tiny change. I don't think it affects their meta or their spot in the meta a whole lot. The combination of Sundered Sky and Sterak's changes, that definitely nerfs a champ like Aurelia. At the same time, Death's Dance is looking pretty strong, and to be honest, one thing that is a little interesting about this patch is that, well, it's the final patch before that big mid-season one coming in 14.10, and on that patch at least, there's a nice buff to Bork for Aurelia. So I did put Aurelia down a little bit for now. I don't think she really benefits from the ability haste. I think the lifesteal and Omnivamp is pretty much irrelevant for Aurelia. So I think she's a tiny bit weaker, but overall probably in the same spot as before. So let's move on to some champions. So first off, we have Akshan, which they reduce the movement speed that you get from his Q for hitting champions. They did give you also less movement speed at later ranks, as you can see here on the non-champions. So overall, this makes skill shot matchups a little more difficult, which is kind of annoying for Akshan because a lot of his hardest counters are some of those skill shot matchups, stuff like Syndra. I honestly think Akshan this patch, I mean, actually, let me finish the change. So the other one is basically that they made his ult deal more damage overall, especially if you're building lots of AD as opposed to on-hit. I think overall this is probably a buff if you're using Akshan as a counter pick, but it's probably a nerf if you're an Akshan one-trick. And the reason for that is because I think this just gives him more scaling overall. And if you're in a winning matchup, I feel like the movement speed, I mean, it's still nice, right? You'd prefer to have it. But I feel like it being given up is not the end of the world. I do think, though, if you're playing Akshan every game, if you're an Akshan one-trick, losing that movement speed definitely hurts into certain matchups. So I put him a tiny bit lower, but again, like I was saying, I think if you're counter-picking with Akshan, he might actually be better than before. Now there is a funny one down here. Let me try and find it. I think it's actually, yeah, they've hidden it in the next one. Okay, so they've got these champions small changes. So the first one is Ahri. And what they've done to Ahri is they've taken 5, you heard that right, they took 5 damage off her W at all ranks, and then they reduced her ult, or sorry, they increased her ult CD at later ranks. So in my opinion, this change doesn't do anything. And the reason is that in the early game, Ahri doesn't really use her W for damage. The W is used for mainly dodging skill shots in the more difficult lanes. It is sometimes used for harassment in the melee lanes, right? And can be used for harass at level 1, but it's more to proc electrocute in range matchups. And obviously in those melee matchups, like the combination of D-Shield second wind, 5 damage, like you were never killing them anyway. That's why you always play first strike Ahri into melees. So I think this change is completely whatever. I don't think it does anything. This one I also think is kind of fake. So I think by the time you're level 11, you're, especially in solo queue, you're going to have Malignance, you're going to have Ultimate Hunter. So obviously this is, if you watch my Unranked to Master Ahri video, you'll know that those times where you don't have ult, it does feel painful, right? Like you're waiting for it to come back up. But I honestly think, you know, especially as you get towards the late game, you're going to have your ult up for every important fight anyway. I guess the nerf, or I guess the effect this is going to have is that for Ahri players that are taking too many fights when they don't have ult, or Ahri players that are maybe playing too aggro and like relying on their ult a bit too much, you know, maybe they're mispositioning a bit too much on mid waves or side waves or something in that mid to late game, I think that could punish you. But honestly, I think especially in the higher elos, I really don't think this impacts Ahri at all. And honestly, I wonder if it affects Ahri in the lower elos either. Because I feel like in those elos, like you're going to get away with a lot of stuff anyway. It's not like, I don't feel anyway that people are going to be punishing your ult for being on cooldown. You know, they're not actively going to be trying to punish that cooldown. So Overall, I'm pretty sure the Ahri changes are fake, and I'm pretty sure she's still easily S. Scrolling down a bit further, we have the Asol change. So Asol's another one that I left pretty much untouched, and I also think this change doesn't really mean a whole lot. Minus 20% AP ratio on E is relevant, for sure, especially in the ultra late game, but I think for the majority of the game, it's not really going to make a difference. And that's because until you get Death Cap, this champ just doesn't have a lot of AP anyway. You know, you're building stuff like Rylai's. It's not like you're going something like a Shadow Flame that just has a lot of AP on it. And normally you get Death Cap a little later on this champ than you do on some others. Like, 4th item is kind of the standard. So you're not going to have that huge AP ratio coming in anyway. And I also think that the E is definitely not that reliable for damage, right? Like, a lot of the time you're using the E just for like the slow or to hold a choke or stuff like that. It's very rare that people are just standing in your E the whole time. I'm not going to say it never happens, right? Like, if you're holding a huge choke, you've got Rylai's, maybe you stun them with your ulti or something, it can definitely happen. But I really just don't think this changes what makes Asol OP, which is that he is a scaling champ that happens to win lane. And that's always been a problem, right? Like, champions last year, like Aurelion Syndra, that did that very well, were also very, very strong. So I'm pretty sure Asol is still very high. Yeah, very high up, especially as long as you don't end up in a super, super bad matchup. Next mid laner here. Okay, so Karma. I did move Karma up a little bit, not a whole lot. So what they did to Karma is they increased the slow on her Q by 5%, which is kind of nice. It definitely allows you sometimes to get like an extra auto or something off with it. That being said, I feel like a lot of the time regular Qs in lane are just used on the wave, you know, and it's like the mantra Qs that you get the poke with. So I think it's like, it's nice, but it's not amazing. And I think it probably affects support Karma more, so you can get that extra auto attack off just by, you know, chasing them down. And these changes here, I mean, Mantra E is more of a support Karma thing as well, or late game is Karma mid, where you're getting so many spells off that your ult is just up all the time. So overall, I did put her up a little bit, but I still kind of feel like Karma is now like a fairly average pick. She's definitely not weak, but fairly average overall, I'd say. The Kassadin change was very weird to me. I'm very surprised that Kassadin got nerfed, because I feel like Kassadin is like pretty much exclusively a counter pick champion. And I don't even feel like Kassadin was OP as a counter pick champion. Whereas there are other champs in this game where, like, if you get them as a counter pick, they just win the game for you, you know? And I honestly don't feel like Kassadin is really like that. I guess Kassadin might be too strong in lower elos, which is why they're kind of nerfing the scaling, so that if, you know, again, those games go super long and low elo and Kassadin ends up with like 900 AP or something, you know, this way he does like less damage. But yeah, I don't know. I was pretty surprised to see this, I guess. I don't consider Kassadin to be super OP. I did move him down a little bit as a result, but honestly, I think if you're using him as a counter pick, he's still very strong. Now, the Malz change was one of the biggest changes of the patch in terms of impact, but I honestly don't think it's going to change much. So it's like, it's big, but it's not big at the same time. So what have they done? First, Q mana is down. This is kind of nice because this allows you to spam it a little more and actually gives you a reasonable amount of poke, right? Like, before it was like definitely too costly to poke with Q in lane, but it is kind of possible now. I think you can poke with Q and then either with Comet or Ahri, and that can add up for a little more damage. So that gives you like a little more aggression. The problem is, a lot of the time, chunking your opponent as a champ like Malzahar doesn't actually do anything, because you never really have a way to get them into like kill threat, right? Like, it's not like you're going to be solo killing people pre-6 as Malzahar. Post-6, I don't think, because you're not maxing this ability, it's not going to deal a whole lot of damage. Now, potentially, there's a world where you max this, but then you don't really have any push. So, to me, it's unlikely, but possibly, you know, that could be something people experiment with. I'll say I haven't tried it. I haven't seen anyone try it, but, you know, in my head, it might have potential. But yeah, so that's kind of nice. And then this one, so the ECD being down by 4, this is kind of good, but again, it's only for a defensive point of view. So the thing is, Malzahar has two big problems in the early game. One is that he basically cannot trade back with anyone, and he has very long cooldowns. There's a similar problem to Zilean, where like his trading ability is also his wave clear ability. So like, but he's also not strong enough to fight people back anyway. So if you think of a champ like LeBlanc, where her wave clear is also her trading ability, she is okay to trade aggressively, and then she can generally create enough threat that she isn't forced to use her ability just to wave clear, right? Like, the opponent can't just push her in the whole time, because it's scary to push in against LeBlanc. The thing is, when you're playing something like Zilean, if your opponent pushes you in, you kind of have to Q the wave, and then that's your only damaging spell gone, and you have nothing left. And it's kind of the same with Malz, is that like, you can E the wave, sure, and that starts pushing it back out, but then they have this really long window to punish you. So now this window is a little smaller, but the problem is that the window still exists, right? And you still have to use it in order to push the wave early if you want to. You can't just like let the wave come into, you know, early, especially like pre-first base. that's probably the best thing to do on Malz, but then you still have the problem of like, well, this champ is still so weak pre-6, and a lot of the champions that it counters, you know, you would typically pick Malz into something like Akali. They actually still bully Malz in the early game, right? Like, it's not like this cooldown being shorter really stops that, because Akali will just win trades whether you have the cooldown up or not. So I honestly think this is, I mean, even though 4 seconds off a cooldown is normally like a massive change, I kind of feel like it doesn't affect a whole lot. There might be some matchups where Malz can like get away with it now, because honestly, Malz's scaling is really good, and the biggest weakness of Malz is just getting punished in the lane. The other big weakness Malz has that I said before is the problem is its voidlings are so killable, and if you kill its voidlings the moment they spawn, he can't actually push the wave like at all. He has pretty much no wave clears. So to me, the champ is kind of a little outdated. There's definitely ways they could band-aid fix it, right? Like they could make his W like more tanky or something, but I feel like it would create a pretty unhealthy gameplay pattern. So yeah, I don't really like that idea. Overall, though, I did move him out of D tier because I do think if you get away with a Malz pick, and he is a broken champ in low elo, if you do get away with a Malz pick, he scales extremely well. The problem is just the higher up in the elo you go, the more and more punish you're going to get in lane, and that could be punished by getting, you know, you're giving your opponent free scaling. It's an awkward thing about Malzahar that, you know, it's kind of that like, okay, I want to sit back and scale champ, but he gets outscaled by, you know, like an A-Sol or Smolder mid into Malz, or you know, what's another one that we've been talking about? You know, you could play Yon into it, and then like, you know, you'd have to buy a QSS, but it'd be very good. I think there's other champs down here like Corki or Veigar that would be very happy to play into Malz. So it's like kind of a counter pick scaling champion, but it only has like very few matchups. And you know, normally if you're picking a counter to something, you're expecting to absolutely stomp it, right? You pick Kassadin to some matchups, it's unplayable. Same with like Vlad or Cassio. You know, those champs cannot play against you. But you pick Malz into something, and it's like, yeah, the team fights are going to be hard, but the enemy laner is going to come out with a big advantage. So it's not as good as you'd think, at least in my opinion. I did move him up a little. And then, so the last two, I think, from mid. Yes, this was the last two from mid, which is Seraphine and Taliyah. So I think the Seraphine change is actually fairly noticeable because, one, Seraphine's big problem is wave clear, I would say. And now this doesn't affect your wave clear early, but it does allow Seraphine to keep farming in the mid game, which is something that I think struggles a lot with. Right, like a lot of the time Seraphine will have decent CS early, but then when it comes to side laning or clearing mid waves, it just takes way too long. So having extra AP, possibly with DMAT, I think potentially does that. And also remember this does proc twice, like with your empowered Q, so it's kind of like a 20% AP ratio increase, which is nice. I did move her up a little bit. I moved her into kind of like the mid B tier. Now, one thing to keep in mind, I guess, is that next patch on 14.10, there's an item called, I think it's like Blackfire Torch or something. I think that might be really, really good on AP Seraphine. So that might be something we have to test out next patch. But for now, I gave her a small increase. I think she is like fairly solid, especially if you don't pick into something that ends up outscaling you, right? Like a Seraphine, if you give free scaling to like Kassadin, Vlad, Corki, A-Sol, that's going to suck. But if you can get into a matchup you can neutralize and end up just kind of like, you know, AoE shielding and healing and then doing damage as well, like that's completely fine. You just really don't want to verse one of those turbo scaling mids. Now, finally, Taliyah. So they nerfed Taliyah's early game by increasing the mana cost on her Q by 10. This is fairly noticeable because you do spam a lot. This makes a big difference to the pre-first base, and that is something that matters a lot for Taliyah because Taliyah is a champ that you're kind of expecting to be behind in the early game because she is not really meant to be that strong of a laner. But at the moment, she has enough push and enough mana to do it that she can just spam push you on the tower, and a lot of the time will have a CS lead just from you being denied CS on the tower, right? Because she's just constantly pushing on the tower. The only way for you to match it is to commit your mana pool as well, and that can make, well, one, it can mean you just run out of mana, but two, it can just make CSing the creeps kind of awkward. So I think I think she's still pretty good. Like I moved her to a low A, but I'm pretty sure the champ is still fairly strong, right? Like it really only affects that pre-first base. And I think that while there are champs that can potentially take advantage of that, you know, maybe like Ori or something, I think a lot of champs still will be unable to punish Taliyah in the early game. And I think once you get your first base, you're probably going to find that between like mana flow tier biscuits that you're still going to have similar push to before. They did also nerf her bonus damage to monsters, which is obviously aimed at Taliyah jungle, but it does affect Taliyah in the mid game because Taliyah is one of the best camp clearers, right? Like Taliyah can absolutely destroy any jungle camp in the mid game. So like if you're pushing the side lane, you can easily go and do Krugs, or you can, you know, run and do the Gromp or something. That's all fine. I think you still can though. Like I think Taliyah overkills these camps a whole lot, and you're probably not really going to notice this. It really is just going to be that early game. So yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for the 14.9 tier list. As you can see, while there were quite a few champs and items changed, I actually don't think the tier list has moved around a whole lot. Some other things I want to mention is that I was going to do the low elo tier list next week, but given how big the 14.10 patch is, I'm probably going to wait until after that comes out. So if you want ideas of what are strong low elo picks in the meantime, you can go back and look at my low elo tier list from last year. It's still fairly relevant in that generally the champs that's strongest in low elo are going to be the ones that are simplest, right? So stuff like Malzahar tend to be very strong, as well as, you know, champs like Ahri, Vex, I think Taliyah is pretty good. So those are some ideas, but again, go back and refer to my low elo tiers from last year and listen to the explanations, and you'll probably find that it's not too different. Other than that, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I imagine the 14.10 tier list is going to be pretty different, and I'll also definitely do a 14.10 rundown the day it comes out, because there is a ton of new items, well, changed items, I guess, and some new items, and hopefully some champion changes as well. But anyway, guys, if you did like this video, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.